Morena, no mai, haere mai, ki te Aotearoa New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Vivian Hunt aho, ka nui te mihi nui ki koutou katoa. My name is Vivian Hunt, and on behalf of the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, I'd like to welcome you all here today to our last Spotlight seminar for 2020. So the purpose of these seminars is to focus on the food safety science and to demonstrate some of the expertise in our network. And today I'm very delighted to welcome researchers from Plant and Food Research who manage the consumer intelligence and collecting insights from plant and food stakeholders and consumers in market to support Plant and Food's food innovation team. They're called the Stakeholder and Consumer Intelligence Team, and it's led by Dr. Denise Conroy, a qualitative research psychologist with over 20 years marketing experience and who is specialized in both working domestically and globally across a range of groups. So Denise is a consumer behaviorist who has specialized in understanding the attitudes, emotions, values that motivate consumer purchases and behavior. Most of her work has been Asia focused, and she's led consumer research insights for the High Value Nutrition Science Challenge. And after working for 20 years at the University of Auckland Business School, where I know Denise from, Denise joined Plant and Food in 2019. So with Denise, we have Ivy Garn, who can raise her hand. That's it. So Denise is beside Ivy. She's a recent PhD graduate who has specialized in qualitative research and she has a special interest in stakeholder and consumer trust across global markets. Also, we have Kim Lowe, who's going to wave her hand. There she is. She has advanced skills and expertise in clinical trials and done both qualitative and quantitative work. And beside her is Tracy Phelps, who brings extensive quantitative and market research experience from her work with numerous FMCG categories. So the title of the seminar today is Food Safety, Consumers and Novel Technology Adoption, and we'll discuss some of the findings that they've had exploring food safety attitudes and to understand some of the concerns, especially from New Zealand consumers' perspectives. So I'll hand over to Denise, who will start off, I think, or draw on the others.
Thanks, Vivian. So kia ora, everyone, and welcome. So paradoxes of consumption. This term really refers to the fact that we know that consumers are quite fearful, I guess, of technologies or new technologies. And until they come to understand the benefits of those technologies, they can be quite rejecting of them. So I came to New Zealand in very late 1980s, and I was working for Bell South, who became Vodafone. And it was the time when mobile phones were first starting to present themselves down here. And at the time, there was a lot of resistance to mobile phones because people really thought that they could be doing us quite a lot of health harm, causing cancers, etc. And so there really was a lot of resistance to having the cell phone towers, etc., anywhere near their homes. And it wasn't until the benefits of having these mobile phones started to outweigh those concerns that we got bigger and bigger acceptance. And of course, now today, most of us would be lost without one, and it's really a computer that we carry around in our pockets these days rather than a phone per se. In fact, in those early phones, if anybody's as old as me, the phones were not being carried in your pocket. They were in a little bag that you had was on wheels because it was still so heavy. So we've come a long way in a relatively short time. But that's the idea of paradoxes, and ever more so with technology when it involves our food, because of course we're ingesting food, so we would anticipate that people may be a bit more concerned about things that are to do with their health and food. So this was some research that we carried out late last year here in New Zealand, and we were really wanting to understand how New Zealand consumers make sense of food safety and perceptions, concerns and attitudes towards unfamiliar food technologies. Now, that's really important to understand. These are lay people, consumers' perceptions. So they're not necessarily factual, in the science, but they are how people believe and understand. And it's really important for us to, as marketers and researchers, to understand the pleasure and pain points for people, because that really means that we can get the positioning right when we come to either giving information out or positioning a new technology. This work was also going to be feeding into several other projects across PFR. Our team is really a platform program, so we don't belong to anyone in particular. We are supporting the research of many people, both internally and externally. So all businesses exist because society allows them to exist, and that's the social license. And just as we were talking, or I was talking before about the telecommunications industry having to nurture people's acceptance of a new technology, the same happens across all technologies. In New Zealand, quite rightfully, we are very concerned about cultural license as well for our Indigenous Maori populations. So we think about not just social, but also cultural acceptance too. And that means it's important that we try to access Maori narratives and Maori voices. Because we are a platform program and we work across so many programs, it's really important for us that we inform ourselves before we go into field by people who know a bit more about things than we do. So for this particular project, we did interviews with technical experts and industry experts in the following areas to see what their concerns were for novel technologies, what they would like to understand, and what they thought the pleasure and pain points might be, and what information they'd be really interested in us finding out. So New Zealand is two main islands. It's really important when we do our work that we don't just go into the main centres. Auckland is where we're from and the biggest city by population, and it's probably got the people who are most removed from food, in that they love food and enjoy food, and we've got fantastic restaurants, but where does that food come from is a mystery to most people. So it's really important for us that we go around the country, and particularly to the growing regions where they may have very different ideas than people who are working in the major cities. We also, because this is a technology project, we thought it was really important to speak with people who were a bit older and a bit younger, because we know from past research that by and large, younger people may be more open to new technologies than older people who perhaps a bit more resistant to it. So we did focus groups in this case with these participants, so 79 in total. So these were the general topics that we discussed. So we wanted to understand food safety. So we did some work with the people in the focus groups around food safety as a topic, but then we introduced these novel technologies as well. So one was X-ray as a phytosanitary treatment, and this was largely to do with the replacement or potential replacement of methyl bromide. The other was controlled environment agriculture, which we introduced as vertical farming because we thought people may be more familiar with that term. And having thought long and hard about it, we decided that we would have to also introduce gene editing, which currently in New Zealand, of course, it is not permitted, but we thought we would introduce this as a topic in conjunction with vertical farming. This was really because we were trying to talk to people about future vertical farming, which may include woody perennials, which obviously is not happening at the moment. And whilst you can get your head around growing lettuces and herbs and berries in a vertical farm at the moment, the thought of growing apple orchards, for example, inside vertical farms is a bit of a stretch. But if you introduce gene editing, perhaps people could find it more accessible. and also cell ag, in this case of fish. So these technologies are available to some extent in some places in the world, but not available in New Zealand. So they're all quite novel here. So food safety was our first one. And we started by just asking people, if we say food safety, what is it that you think we're talking about? You guys can read 5 times faster than I can speak, so I'm not going to read the quotes out. You can be reading those whilst I speak. But they really fell into these 4 areas. So things like hygiene and individual practice, and production and products, and supply chain and food regulation. So those were the general areas that people think about when we first say food safety. In terms of responsibility, who is responsible for food safety? It was pretty well seen that we were all responsible, and the government was responsible, and food industry. And collectively, New Zealand has quite the food safety halo. Most people, when we do a lot of work overseas, usually, not at the moment, of course, so we're used to going to places like China, Vietnam and South Korea, where people say that food from New Zealand is extremely safe. So it was great to see this reflected here in New Zealand as well, that people think that we have very good processes in place. It's not to say that there will never be a problem, but if there is a problem, it will be something that has occurred because of an accident and will be rectified because there would be harsh penalties. Things like food poisoning, people tend to think are self-inflicted. So you've got out, had a great night out, perhaps a couple too many wines or beers, come home, and the pizza that's been on the bench for 2 nights, you decide is still perfectly safe to eat, and you get a bit of food poisoning. So people tend to associate food poisoning in New Zealand with that self-inflicted, if you like, rather than being something that they should be wary of, which again, we see as being quite different to other markets that we visit. So the food strategies that people just do in day-to-day life really varied. So for some people, really, they looked at us as if we were a bit crazy, you know, why would I wash my fruit and veg, you know, whilst others saying they do, that's what they do, the washing, they do the peeling. Interestingly, we had some people who are Australian in the team, in the focus groups, and they would do the washing because they were still thinking that there could be poisonous spiders in the fruit, which may be common in Australia, but we don't have those in New Zealand, but that was just a habit. For some people, they approached raw chicken as very cautiously, and others not so much. People thought buying local was a really good idea because of food safety, that we grow things very safely from the orchard or the field right the way through to the retailer, care is taken. And that by buying organic, you avoid sprays. So again, that's a perception thing. Or you could grow your own, because lots of people in New Zealand have access to a reasonable sized garden. Definitely there was avoidance for food safety reasons of certain food products and certain brands from certain countries. And those countries included, which we found a little bit surprising, the United States. People tended to think that things from the United States and China were the least safe. So general trust in and loyalty to New Zealand food. People were very proud of New Zealand food and the practices here. So isolated occasions of food safety breaches in New Zealand. General trust in food safety regulation in New Zealand was very strong. And then the loyalty, because of the perceived very high standard that happens in New Zealand. Okay, so then we moved on to X-ray as a phytosanitary treatment. And as I said before, this was really motivated for us by New Zealand wanting to move away from methyl bromide, or the alternative is that New Zealand's going to have to recapture the methyl bromide, which will be quite an expensive thing to do. So this necessarily went to biosecurity, and people were by and large very pragmatic about biosecurity in New Zealand. Most New Zealanders are very aware that we grow food and we export food. And that we are very protective of our borders because of that. So we don't want to get pests in that we don't have currently. And so the understanding was that other countries would feel the same. If we were exporting to another country, maybe we have a pest that they don't want. So understanding that biosecurity is really important was very strong. There was pretty low understanding of what that means in real terms, in terms of how these things actually go about. So very few people understood that methyl bromide is used. I would say the exception would be in Tauranga, which is a port where a lot of our logging industry transports from, and people there were very much more aware of methyl bromide being used than in general. So we had to actually carefully, because we don't want to bias people, we had to explain about methyl bromide and why it was used, and get their reactions after that. So knowledge of X-ray gave people both assurance, but also threw up confusion. So people were concerned that, you know, you go to the dentist and the dentist goes out of the room if he or she is giving you an X-ray. So what is it that's going to be different here? Is it dangerous? How are they going to contain it? Does it leave radiation on the fruit? Is there some residue? What happens? What if it fails and, you know, somebody bites into an apple and it's full of worms or spiders? So a little bit of confusion there. Definitely people would escalate quite quickly from X-ray to nuclear because of a lack of understanding. And a few participants had a bit more knowledge. We had a couple of medical people, and so they were a little bit more, obviously, more understanding and able to educate the group, which we kind of prefer because we don't want to be biasing the groups. But there are also really strongly perceived advantages of X-ray. So people were seeing it probably as a lesser of two evils. The idea that, you know, something goes through an X-ray is preferable to, I think someone said, munching down on chemicals. So, you know, that was seen as something they didn't know about replacing something. So you're replacing methyl bromide with X-ray. That's a very different conversation than introducing something, as if we did nothing now and now we're going to start X-raying your fruit and veg. And so people were much calmer about things when they understood that we were replacing and not introducing. There's also food in New Zealand is perceived, or fresh food in New Zealand is perceived as expensive. And so this was seen as a bit of a win-win. Could it be cost effective and save the ozone layer? To be fair, we also introduced the idea of hot water washing and scrubbing as an alternative to X-ray and methyl bromide. And we actually thought that this would be the preferred option, that people would see this as the way to go. But they linked it straight away to sustainability issues and thought that the use of water and the power to heat the water would make it just something that the planet would not want to tolerate. And so they definitely did not want this as an option. There was also some concern that it would not be able to kill any bugs that may be inside the fruit and veg, and therefore would be a problem for safety as well. So concerns with X-ray around food safety and quality, and wanting to know whether it's used in other countries was a lot of questions on that, and we said it was. Wanting to know which countries, because they wouldn't believe information coming from places like, again, the US and China. Wanting to know if there'd been any long-term adverse effects in these other countries, how long had they been using it, you know, very much like we heard when I was first involved in mobile phones. Well, it might be all very well now, but what in 20 years will we regret using this technology? So has anybody been using it for a very long time? And if so, has it been monitored throughout? Cost, you know, New Zealand is a small country with a small economy, so these machines were perceived to be very expensive. Who's going to pay? Surely the individual industries, say Apple and Pear, can't pay, so then it comes down to government, and that means us as taxpayers. And if that happens, will things go up in price even more because they're trying to recoup the costs? What we perhaps hadn't anticipated was safety of workers coming up. So the concern that, you know, they're unfamiliar with these facilities, so how do they work? Are people going to be safe working in these facilities? Again, looking overseas, are there operator errors? Is it going to have really bad effects on health? And that caused quite a lot of debate in all of the focus groups. And again, went back to trust in New Zealand, in our safety practices, that actually the workers are likely to be safe because they will be fully trained and everything will be as it should be in terms of operation. There may be operator errors, but that again comes down to human error rather than a true safety concern. So then we moved on to vertical farming, which again they largely perceived as not a new idea. Pretty well everybody was familiar with the concept of a greenhouse, and in New Zealand you don't have to travel very far to see quite big, usually tomato houses. So people were quite familiar with the idea, and also that different ways of growing went on inside of these vertical farms as well. We did get perceptions of naturalness, and they went from, yes, we think it's really natural, to, no, this is not a natural growing environment. So it's still growing, it's still a plant, it's still being grown. No, it's not natural, it's controlled light, there's no actual rain, there's no soil, how can this be natural? So again, these are perceptions, of course. But the idea was that people generally thought if they were going to be inside a controlled environment, there'd be no need for pesticides and they would be spray-free. They thought there would be year-round yielding. So, you know, you'd be able to access things the whole year. Less use of land and space, which was considered something that perhaps New Zealand doesn't need, but we could develop the technology and then sell that or the IP overseas, and that would be a really good idea. And the idea that there could be, you know, potentially for the planet in the future, fewer food miles because we could grow more food. So they weren't thinking of us exporting and what that would do to our export markets, but really that was a sustainability narrative that we saw going on. And it was by and large perceived as maybe this is the perfect produce to feed the world. Apparently there are going to be another 1 billion people turning up, and so how are we going to feed them with nutritious food? Maybe it'll make it cheaper, it'll be good quality and healthy, and we can feed the world with this technology. We have, and that was, you know, particularly, we thought that might be something for the younger people, but everybody was feeling much the same. There were, of course, still concerns. So some people thought, well, you know, if you're in an environment, what would happen if, you know, something gets in there like a mold, and would you lose whole crops and things like that? Nutrients, some people wondered whether they would be as nutrient dense if they're grown indoors and in different kinds of growing environments, whether that's lights or the differences of soils. Other stakeholders, what about, we're a nation of small businesses by and large here in New Zealand. What happens to all these small businesses? What happens to farmers? And then this is going to be a big power bill. Who's going to foot that? And what about the planet? So understanding that we don't yet have a technology that would allow us to be sustainable in this kind of growing. And again, the future being unsure. So we went from personal acceptance being yes and yeah, but. So liking the idea, I choose it any day. And then maybe it's good for others. So again, not New Zealand, but you know, other countries. And what about the next generation? Maybe they are the ones that will be accepting of this because of planetary needs and sustainability issues. So that's when we invited gene editing into our conversation and explained that at the moment we can grow the leafy greens, herbs and a few berries, but if we were going to put woody perennials in these, possibly this could be done by breeding and possibly it could be accelerated by genetic editing. And again, we explained genetic editing with great caution because we didn't want to be biasing the conversation. So the positives were clear as well. I'm all for it. People generally thought that we are really good at breeding here in New Zealand and that this was just a advancement on that or accelerated breeding. So we were quite surprised to see some of these reactions, but we also, of course, saw concerns. Some were ethics in terms of if it's all done behind closed doors, then, you know, they could be doing anything. A lot of it was fear of the unknown. And we heard time and time again that New Zealand has not had this conversation for over 20 years. And so we heard from people in their early 40s saying that when this conversation was last going, they had other things on their mind because they were at university and having a good time and not thinking of this stuff. And so they hadn't had a chance to be even part of this conversation, and that they would welcome the conversation in New Zealand. And that's not to say that they were positively accepting of it, they just would like the conversation to be opened again. And there was concern that we would be, as New Zealanders, losing good intellect because scientists get trained here in New Zealand and then can't work in this area and so have to go overseas. But there's concern for side effects again and long-term effects, much as we've seen before. So this, okay, we're eating something now and we're all fine. What about in 20 years? And then concern for who benefits from this. You know, will it go to big business or will farmers and small businesses be able to benefit from this? So fish in a dish was how we introduced Cell Ag. Most people were familiar with the idea of lab meat as growing, but not the idea of fish. So this provoked a lot of conversation and a lot of curiosity. So fake and artificial were terms that we heard all the time. Even though it's being grown from cells of fish, it can't be real. It's not true fish making baby fish. There were a lot of thinking that, you know, maybe future generations will think this is fine because they won't have had the opportunity to have had real fish. People did see benefits. Most people understand that, you know, the oceans aren't pollution-free anymore, and so that if something was grown in a lab, then it would be pollution-free. Lots of people in New Zealand aren't so keen on aquaculture and think that's not such a good industry in terms of environment, so environmental benefits. A few people thought, you know, maybe this is better for animal welfare because you're not going out hunting the fish. And also the idea that, you know, maybe this, again, we can feed the world. Maybe this is the way to do it. So again, this is not for me, but for others. And we heard quite a lot of, oh, you know, be able to feed prisoners and people like that. It would be great. Again, food safety came in. People were concerned because they don't understand how do you grow this? What do you feed the culture on that actually grows this? Is that some kind of poison? What's it going to do to us? Is it dangerous? Diversity. People were quite concerned, okay, if we lose the skills of fishing and then something happens, what would happen then? That if this industry, something happened to this cell industry and we no longer have the skills, that's not a good thing, is it? And there was, you know, lots of people in New Zealand make a living out of the fishing industry one way or another. So lots of concern, does this take away jobs or would they be able to transfer, but it's not the same? All of those things. So there was some attitudes of acceptance. Always good to have young males in these focus groups because they tend to be willing to eat anything. So yes, I definitely try it. You know, a novelty. Some people are a lot more food phobic than others. Some people are novelty seeking. Others, I'd rather stay with real fish. And I think the majority were open-minded. Okay, if someone else tries this first and says it's okay, then I'll give it a go. Or if another country that I trust has this on the menu, then I think it's something we can do. So just going over some of the concerns quickly. So safety is definitely a major concern. You know, people are very concerned about their food, or they certainly say they're concerned about their food, and they're concerned long term. And interestingly, not just for themselves, but the workers that may be exposed to these technologies or be disadvantaged in terms of their income. Ethical and social concerns were very much evident, impact on farmers, fishermen, etc. Human ethics, you know, if things are going on behind closed doors, who's in charge? But definitely, you know, animal welfare, environment and sustainability were written large in this. And for us, biosecurity and biodiversity were definitely topics that came up too. So in terms of, you know, thinking about things that could help address these, people definitely wanted evidence from other countries, but not just any country. So Australia, people are quite happy if Australia's doing it, which is the case for X-ray. Then they thought that that was quite a good way that we could think about, okay, what's happening in Australia. They really wanted safety from ongoing research in New Zealand. So again, that was the trust of the home country. Is this work going on in New Zealand? Because we know that that would be well monitored and well executed, and we could trust it. And the idea that we'd be foolish not to be involved in all of these technologies, because then we'd just be buying it instead of leading it and potentially selling it. Lots of information, careful information education is needed. Some wonderful debates about labelling, from people wanting everything to be labelled. So, you know, if something goes through X-ray, I want a big label on it that tells me everything. And then other people saying, which is great in focus groups because people talk things up and down, well, how often do you actually read a label? And people then go, no, you don't even see the labels. And we know label blindness exists because, you know, cigarette industry, for example, when they first started labelling, it was a very modest label in terms of smoking can damage your health, through to the labels now, which are, you know, really confrontational. and people get label blindness. So although people say they want labels, they're kind of, yeah, but really, do we use them? Information does improve understanding and acceptance, but it's who they would trust to provide the information that needs really careful thought. So it needs to be consumer friendly. So, you know, rather than it's science, people want actual layperson's language, and to be really mindful that superficial knowledge and insufficient education can drive consumers towards rejection. Transparency and trust came up time and time again. So again, keeping people informed, not having hidden agendas. The science community came out great, and this was pre-COVID. So, you know, right now science has got a bit of a halo anyway, but pre-COVID, science community still came out here in New Zealand as being very credible and trustworthy. And trust, again, trust in New Zealand, trust in our practices, our governance, and our people. So Mick and Fournier were the first people to look at paradoxes, and these first four were really their theory, and that was back in 1998. And I think what we found to add to that theory was really that transparency and trust was really, really important, and that people are now much more concerned with ethics and social justice in terms of good for the planet, good for the people, than perhaps Mick and Fournier were finding in the 90s. What we did find was that really it's all about trade-offs, and that would be a future project that we'd be very keen on. So either for food safety and quality, the end product I think is probably the most important thing. If it's disease-free and therefore pesticide, fungicide-free, all that sort of carry on, then it's got to be advantageous. So what is more important for people? And we've seen these trade-offs in the COVID experience as well. Many people pre-COVID were moving away from plastics for their food wrappings, and then in comes COVID, people get concerned again, and so putting things back into plastic is what they want, so fewer people have handled it, and so priorities shift as context shifts. And sustainability is a really important thing for them. I'm going to put up with more unnaturalness, so things can be grown indoors, things can be x-rayed, if it's better for the environment than the use of, say, methyl bromide. What we also found that people went from food safety to food well-being, health, waste and sustainability. So, you know, in New Zealand, we're very fortunate in that we have plenty of food. But for some people, they saw this as being a waste culture, and that we're very much a throwaway society, even in terms of food. Manufactured food was considered to be cheaper, but less healthful. But things like fruit and vegetables and milk, which we produce in abundance in New Zealand, were seen as really expensive. Some people thought we imported far too much food. And that we're just not caring as much as we should be. So quickly, just to summarise, high trust in New Zealand food practice. So this was really, really overarching. The benefits and advantages with new food technologies were understood by people, whether they were accepting or rejecting of them, they did understand them. Most people were pretty pragmatic in terms of, well, you know, new things come, and so maybe I would try them, maybe they'd be the right product for somebody else. Safety was definitely a major concern, and not necessarily immediate, but concern for the future, what happens in 20 years. Younger groups, perhaps as we would expect, were more concerned than older groups about the environment, climate change, etc. But we saw no total rejection of technologies from consumers. and no massive consumer protest against the adoption of the technologies that we discussed, which again, we were a little bit surprised about. So for us, we're going to be doing other work, of course. We're currently in field. In fact, we do our last interview today in household food safety and food waste. So looking at whether concern for food safety is one of the components driving food waste. We're going to be hopefully going to Australia to try to look at stakeholders there. So we're keen to, they've got a low beam X-ray facility in Melbourne that's relatively new. So we'd like to talk to the investors, because if people putting money in, there's usually a reason for it. So why are they keen on this technology? Through to the people who work there, and the retailers in Australia are 50-50. So one group of retailers are keen on putting products that are through X-ray into their stores, one have rejected. So we're really keen to understand why that's the case, and obviously what New Zealand can learn about these. And we've got a very large project on future urban consumers, which was a title we thought up without considering the acronym, but we're stuck with it now. And that's really over a four-year project where we're really looking much more detail about closed environment agriculture and possibly genetic editing as part of that as well.
Great.
So as ever, you never do this work in isolation. So I'd just like to acknowledge Graham Fletcher and Lisa Jameson for funding. Obviously all the people who talked to us and gave their time to us, and the industry stakeholders, and all the people who helped with the analysis, which was quite fast. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Denise. So if anyone's got questions, you can either put them in chat or mention them over the call. Just unmute yourself before you do. That's fascinating. I'll just start off with a question. Do you think, so this trust in our systems and everything came out as an overriding theme. Do you think that New Zealanders are a little bit too trusting? What's your feeling on that?
I think no, really. Having spent lots of time in other countries, I think we do have, we're not perfect, but I think that we do have pretty good processes in place. Consumers are largely naive, of course, in terms of what actually happens at farm onwards. But we do not have that many instances of things that would alarm them. Whereas we do find that obviously in some other countries and environments.
I wonder if anyone from MPI is on the call would like to comment on that. Because we have a few product recalls, but I think we have some good systems in place for product recall.
And I think that's the difference. People feel that if something goes wrong, then a hand goes up and says an error has occurred and things happen to correct it, which doesn't happen in all countries.
And just one other question I had was also, you mentioned Australia as being a country that people trust. Were there any other countries that came up as countries that they trust?
Not that it's country, but Europe, but then they started specifying within Europe. So Germany comes across as somewhere that they would trust, whereas Poland wouldn't. So I guess I'm trying to remember now, but I think England was trustworthy, or Great Britain as well. I think Spain wasn't. So I think that was perhaps places that people had been to actually experience things.
Okay, I've got a question from Arno here. So New Zealand is internationally seen to be doing very well with COVID. Europe's very jealous. Do you think that this is going to strengthen trust in New Zealand procedures?
I would say yes. I think that it gives us a great halo and opportunity. I think that we already have, in our export markets, we're seen as having very good procedures and from farm to retail anyway, and I think this can only strengthen that perception.
Yeah. Leon says, Denise, 2 questions, maybe I missed it, but how many people were involved in the total of all the focus groups? And second, assume you followed similar studies in other countries, and were there any insights very specific to New Zealand, or most attitudes you found were typical in other parts of the globe? That's from Leon, who's in the Netherlands.
Okay. So thanks, Leon. I'm just checking. Yes, 79 participants. So this is very much interpretive qualitative data. It's not meant to be normalized to population. We're not suggesting that at all. The kind of work we do, we tend to work at the descriptive end of the research continuum rather than the cause-effect end. What we really want to know, like if you do big surveys, which is what's being done overseas, it tells you what's going on, but it doesn't tell you why. So we really want to know the why, because we want to understand people's values. Values tend to be universal, but the expression of values tend to shift across time, but also cultures. So easy example of that is all cultures respect the newly deceased, but how they express that can be very different, from the need to bury within 24 hours to the need to have a 2-week party. So we want to not just know that there is respect for the newly deceased, we want to know why and how that is actually expressed. So we make no claim for generalization for this work. We would just really, this is descriptive work, and we would follow on this by doing more survey type analysis.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah has asked, any suggestions on how you keep this high confidence in the food safety system and science?
Yeah, I think we need to, we always need to be moving forward, and I think we need to take these insights and say, okay, what does that tell us? So if we start to move into new technologies, for example, we know that people are going to go, wait a minute, so what is it that they're telling us that they need? And, you know, I think scientists that do fantastic work, they're not always great at then speaking to the public. You know, around here, I just look in horror when I see what people are labeling some of their work as, which would just cause heart attacks in the public, but to them is perfectly normal. So I think we just have to take this work and work like this and say, okay, how do we then make sure that we retain that confidence? How do we carefully engage with the public?
Yeah, that's great. Paula has asked, how did you recruit your participants for the study?
Okay, so we used a market research recruiting agency. We wanted, again, you can't sample population here because you can only get people who want to take part to take part. So, you know, I'm not saying that 100% representative, but we wanted a mix as much as you could of representation of New Zealand in terms of socioeconomic status, age, gender. We made sure that we recruited Maori Pacific Islander. So, you know, you kind of do your best, but you also, in this work, you want people who can talk and express, because that's what you're trying to get, their ideas and perceptions. So you don't want silent people.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. And yeah, I guess it's always hard to get a good cross representation, but it sounds like you divide everyone between young and old. I noticed.
Yes.
I don't know what old was. I suppose it's over. What's old?
It wasn't that old. 45 to 70.
Oh, right. That's old. Okay. Right. That's great. Thank you. Just another question. A couple of questions. Kang Wang from the University of Auckland, who you might know, says, thank you so much for this nice talk. Do you think the microbial safety issue in the hydroponic system could become a big concern from consumers' perspectives in either New Zealand or Australia?
I think these are things that are a bit unknown by consumers, and so they only tend to come out if there is a problem. So I think that if I was advising somebody who had such a business, I would say that you would have to put in place plans for if something happens, how do you address it? Because there is such trust in New Zealand between consumers and producers that there is a lot of forgiveness. And so, yeah, that's like any relationship. If you've got great trust, there tends to be great forgiveness as well. So if you can actually keep things transparent, you're more likely to nurture forgiveness than actually be the end of the relationship.
Okay. There's a quick comment from Leon who says, thank you, Denise and team. I'm not questioning, he wasn't questioning the observations about just asking for the number. And thank you for the presentation. Although he thinks he misheard that in Europe, Holland was not a country trusted by New Zealand consumers. I think you said Poland or Holland.
I said Poland, sorry. No, Holland's great.
Leon's from the Netherlands, so he would.
Yeah, no, we love the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think New Zealand and Netherlands have quite a similar attitude to food and food safety.
Yes,
having worked there myself in the Netherlands, I know.
Yeah, no, we love you.
Especially doing a lot in the whole novel food space. So look, I think there's any more questions, if you quickly fire them out. Otherwise, we'll call it to a close, and I'd like to say thank you very much to Denise and team for a wonderful presentation. And I do hope we can see, get sort of another presentation on your next lot of work, because that was, that looks pretty fascinating too, what's happening in Australia, especially. Yes, we'd really like to, say thank you very much again. And just to say that our next seminar will be the end of February, because we're now going to have holiday season, and it's the 26th of February, and we're going to be repeating what we're doing in Auckland next week, which is a face-to-face seminar on safety, authenticity, risk assessment of novel foods and natural health products. So we're going to repeat that as a Zoom, and we've got speakers from FSANZ and Plant and Food, and that I think it should be an interesting topic. How we make sure novel foods, emerging proteins, and natural health products are safe. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating, and it looks like we had a record turnout. So great news. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Yes, thank you very much. Nice to see you, Leon and Arno.